Hello and welcome to Filling the Sink, a podcast from Catalan News. My name's Beth Cohen and today we're talking about the Dana. On the 29th of October, an isolated upper-level depression affected Spain, causing torrential rain and flooding. Over 220 people died in what was one of the deadliest natural disasters in Spanish history. 1 month on, we discuss the tragedy, explore whether Catalonia is prepared for this kind of meteorological phenomenon, and question why these slow-moving storm systems are becoming increasingly frequent. Joining me today is Catalan News journalist Oriol Escudé. Hello, Oriol.
Hello, Beth. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Excited to be here.
Oriol, this is a topic that made world headlines, but let's start from the very beginning. What exactly happened?
So, as you said, on October 29th, Spain suffered catastrophic flash floods. It was the most tragic flood-related event in Europe in the last 50 years. The main affected area is Valencia, but also Castilla-La Mancha and Andalusia were affected. We're recording this on November 26th, and so far 229 are confirmed dead, and most of them in Valencia.
So how much did it actually rain?
So it rained historical figures not seen since 1996. In just 24 hours, some areas in Valencia registered over 770 litres per square metre.
That's more than what it rains annually on average in Barcelona, right?
Yeah.
That's the whole of the rainfall for the year on one single day.
Exactly. And in some areas, in only 1 hour, it rained over 185 litres per square metre. That's an absolute record in Spanish history.
So what caused it?
The weather phenomenon that caused it, it's called locally in Spain and France a Dana.
And what does Dana stand for, D-A-N-A?
Depresión aislada en niveles altos.
Isolated upper-level depression.
Exactly. And it's also called gota fría, literally cold drop. Basically, what it does is that it brings heavy rains during autumn along the Spanish and French Mediterranean coast. The event happens when cold and warm air meet and produce powerful rain clouds, which then leads to rains with a lot of intensity.
And so this storm hit Valencia first, but then it came to Catalonia, right?
Exactly. While the impact in Catalonia was significantly less severe, it still served as a reminder of how dangerous these weather events can be. But fortunately, the lessons learned from the Valencia floods meant that everyone was better prepared and more aware this time. In Catalonia, the Dana primarily affected southern regions close to Valencia, like the Ebro regions, but it eventually reached Barcelona. We saw images of the airport runway completely flooded, cars trapped in flooded streets, mobility restrictions in the AV7, minor flooding in some homes.
And for example, in Cadaqués, over 30 cars were swept away by the floodwaters.
Yeah, exactly. But fortunately, apart from cars and material damage, there were no serious injuries and no one died. The earlier experience in Valencia acted as a wake-up call, and both authorities and citizens were aware and well prepared for the situation, which we could say it was well managed.
It's not the first time that flooding has affected Catalonia and Valencia. In fact, in 1957, the Turia River in Valencia burst its banks, causing the death of 81 people. And as a result, the government diverted the course of the river to the south, away from the city centre. However, these severe weather events seem to be increasingly frequent. Oriol, how much do you think this is related to climate change?
So many experts have pointed to climate change as the reason why these events are more intense and frequent. They also argue that global warming is making it harder for weather agencies to predict them, or that the predictions are not as accurate as they used to be. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez echoed this sentiment during the COP29 summit in Baku, saying that climate change kills and citing the Valencia floods as evidence.
To find out more, Oriol spoke to scientists and climate change experts Pino and Davide Faranda. Let's hear how they got on.
So my name is David Pino. I'm full professor of physics in the Universitat Politécnica de Catalunya. And my research is focused on different aspects of the atmospheric science.
I'm Davide Faranda. I'm a research director in France at the National Center for Scientific Research, and I'm an expert of extreme events. So the climate change is definitely contributing to increase the intensity of extreme events. which means that now when we observe a dana or when we observe a heat wave or a drought, they are all intensified. So the dana will carry more rain, the heat wave will be hotter, and the drought will be drier, basically. But what we see is that the frequency of the events is not changing in time.
The main point is that the Spanish Mediterranean basin has a climate or an historical climate that is characterized by long periods with low precipitations, I would say. So in general, precipitations are quite low. But when it rains, usually it rains some kind of torrential rain. So a torrential precipitation, intense precipitation. So we have a combination of droughts and intense precipitation. The dana in Valencia, it's quite an extreme phenomenon, but it's not unusual. This is a very important point. The precipitation were a bit more intense than what would be without climate change. We're talking about maybe between 10 and 50% more rain because of climate change. It's clear that climate change may increase the intensity of precipitation, so it will rain more intense in a shorter amount of time, and it seems that climate change may also produce that these extreme phenomena may occur more often. But this is something we saw in the past as well. The role of climate change here, climate change produced by human activity, maybe there is a role, but the role is, I would say, a minor role for the moment, or we don't have enough statistics. And I'm not a climate change denial. This is a very important point. But this is something that has occurred many times in the Spanish Mediterranean basin.
The frequency and the intensity is increasing, but in fact it's just the intensity, and all the storms are reaching this guard level or this red alert level that now is done by the meteorological authorities more often, and that's why we have to be more cautious with the warnings.
Decrease a lot our vulnerability by having, for instance, warnings, meteorological warnings, hydrological warnings. But if we don't take into account these warnings, our vulnerability increases like hell. And we, in the last 50 years, 60 years, we did many things that didn't take into account what are the characteristics of this Mediterranean climate. And this is where we are. We are really exposed to this type of floods, this type of precipitation, because we built in places that normally the water used to flow there. So this is the key point. So we spend many decades putting buildings, putting infrastructure, without caring, without considering if this area was exposure to flooding or not.
We have to think that climate change is not something static. If we keep warming the atmosphere, the events that we see will become more intense. So we can draw maps of floodings, but these maps evolve in time. So the flooded regions will extend, and some buildings, some city that is not at flood risk now can be at flood risk in the near future, or is already at flood risk. If we really want to solve the problem or save an incredible amount of money, life and time, we should reduce the CO2 emissions. It is our common responsibility.
Thank you, Oriol, for bringing us that report. So, how has the government responded following the extreme weather in Catalonia?
So the Catalan government is focusing on several key measures to prepare better for such events, especially since climate change makes them more intense and frequent. Flooding is the main natural hazard in Catalonia, and the region has a long history of flood episodes consuming significant material and human losses. For example, one of the biggest floods that Catalonia has seen happened in 1962, with over 700 people killed, and there's been several other episodes throughout history. And one of the proposals from the Catalan government to be better prepared for these events is to reassess activities in flood-prone areas.
Can you define what flood-prone areas are?
Yeah, so we've heard a lot about flood-prone areas recently. Flood-prone areas are regions that are more likely to experience flooding due to their geographical, hydrological, or climatic conditions. For example, areas near rivers or streams, coastal zones, or urban areas with poor drainage, low-lying inland areas, or areas near dams. So there's many areas that are likely to experience flooding.
How are they classified, and how many are there in Catalonia?
So there's 3 levels of risk based on how often flooding is likely to happen, according to several studies of water flow and landscape. There are areas at high risk where flooding is likely to happen every 10 years. Then we have areas at intermediate risk where flooding is expected once every 100 years. And then low risk areas where flooding is likely every 500 years.
And do people actually live in these areas?
Yeah, and actually a lot. In Catalonia, which as a reminder has 8 million inhabitants, over 700,000 people, 9% of the population, live in areas at risk of flooding every 500 years. In these areas, there are more than 220 schools and 50 care homes for the elderly, for example. And there are people even at a higher risk. Over 110,000 Catalans live in areas where flooding is expected every 10 years.
That's a really high risk of flooding.
Yeah.
Where are these areas?
So the main area affected is the south in El Delta del Ebre, but there are many towns and cities around Barcelona at high risk of flooding, such as El Prat de Llobregat, Sant Adrià de Besòs, Gavà.
And why have we built in these areas?
Well, this is something that has happened for a long time. First, because before there was limited awareness of how flooding could pose a risk to the population. We've also seen the population grow a lot, and this has played a big part as there's less land available and we have had to build around the cities because we needed more space. And some of these areas were in flood-prone areas. For example, near the Besòs River or the Llobregat River around Barcelona. For example, El Prat de Llobregat, which is a prime location for trade and transport, it's been heavily urbanized. Basically, I would say because we prioritized economy over safety.
And is building in these areas still allowed?
So today in Catalonia, it's forbidden to build schools, care homes or health centers in all risk areas, even in those with a 500-year return period. But it is still allowed to build homes in these areas if it's accepted by civil protection and the Catalan Water Agency.
So I'm guessing the authorities must have flood plans.
They do, and they're supposed to have them, especially those areas at a high risk. But in Catalonia, there are 521 towns required by law to have a local plan against flooding, and 6 out of 10 don't have it or have it expired. And this is the case of big cities, for example, Badalona, Montcada i Reixac, Vilassar de Mar.
Whoa. So given recent events, is anything being done to change this?
Yes, so basically this was one of the main measures announced by the Catalan government after the Dana. In the next 2 years, the government wants all towns to have an updated flood plan, especially those at high risk. And they also announced that they will review all activities carried out in these flood-prone areas.
And apart from preventive measures, it's also crucial for authorities to respond effectively when these extreme weather events occur. And one key tool that civil protection has is this. If you live in Catalonia, you've probably heard it recently.
Yes, this is the civil protection alarm. This went off a few times during the Dana in Catalonia, depending on the area it was happening. The way this system works is that all phones in the area are turned on at the same time and emit this loud sound. And then the screen displays an alert message explaining the emergency and giving instructions on what to do. The system is very accurate. It reaches all the affected population within 5 minutes and only within the specific zone to avoid spreading panic to other areas that are not affected.
To learn more about how Catalonia handles extreme weather events, we visited the Protecció Civil Control and Crisis Centres, where we spoke with the Deputy Director of Operations, Imma Solé.
Protecció Civil ens preocupem d'aquelles circumstàncies que poden tenir un gran impacte a multitud de població.
At Civil Protection, we focus on circumstances that can have a significant impact on a large number of people. For example, an emergency such as a car accident or someone having a heart attack is handled by the emergency services. They deal with everyday emergencies. However, when an emergency arises that is so widespread that it affects many people with serious consequences, the regular services often lack the capacity to deal with these large-scale situations. This is where we step in to coordinate.
Llavors, per això entrem des de Protecció Civil. Nosaltres estem en permanent contacte amb la sala 112, que rep les trucades d'emergència.
We are in constant contact with the 112 emergency hotline, firefighters, police, medical services, but also transport companies and utilities like Endesa. They provide us with vital information about what is happening. And probably even more important is the communication with the meteorological services, because they alert us when there is a forecast that can have a significant impact, so we can prepare for scenarios that have a higher impact than a typical day.
Perquè es puguin preparar per aquestes circumstàncies que poden ser d'un major impacte que no pas un moment normal del dia a dia. Quan enviem aquests missatges molt massius a la població?
When we send mass messages to the population, it's because it's critical for people to know about a certain situation and take action to protect themselves and ensure their health or safety at a given moment. These messages often instruct people to shelter in place, stay in a safe area, or evacuate to avoid a dangerous situation. For example, they may need to leave a dangerous area and move to a safer location.
Possiblement podria ser també que evacuï, que marxi d'un espai on pot estar en perill per un risc i se'n vagi a una altra zona on aquest risc no existeixi. La majoria de mòbils dels últims models, dels que són més freqüents que la gent porti,
alerts are set by default on most phones, except for a few versions of very old phones that don't have them. Alerts cannot be disabled because they are critical to citizen safety. Alerts are issued very rarely, and when they are, it's because you need to take action to protect yourself from danger. Everyone in the affected area receives them, and we always send these alerts in Catalan, Spanish, and English so that everyone, including tourists, can read them.
Nosaltres quan les enviem sempre amb els dos idiomes, en català i en castellà, i també l'enviem en anglès. Va ser pel qual, quan teníem aquests avisos de pluja intensa...
During the Dana, when we had forecasts of heavy rain over a couple of days, we issued alerts asking the public to limit mobility, only going out if absolutely necessary, and advise them to stay indoors.
De resguardar-se dintre d'un edifici, de confinar-se en un edifici, doncs va ser el motiu pel qual vam enviar aquestes alertes per anar avisant a la població de quan es produïen aquests fets. Nosaltres el que veiem i el que...
What we are seeing, supported by science and ongoing research, is that climate change is leading to more extreme weather events. They are becoming more frequent and we need to be better prepared for them. Knowing how to respond when such risks materialize is critical. Our goal is to promote risk awareness and ensure that people understand how to act when faced with hazards. Knowledge is critical to ensuring safety in critical situations.
Que la gent conegui com actuar en un moment donat que es produeix que es materialitza aquest perill, que aquest risc es dona, doncs saber com actuar i conèixer-ho.
Thanks to Imma Solé for taking the time to share your expertise. I think that what happened in Valencia was so unprecedented and unexpected that it was hard for authorities to be properly prepared. However, I believe that there was some controversy about the government's handling of the situation in Valencia.
Yep, in fact, the disaster in Valencia has highlighted how important is the role of governments and authorities in ensuring public safety. The response to the flood has sparked widespread criticism, particularly targeting the regional government and its president, Carlos Mazón. We've seen protests involving thousands calling for Mazón to resign, and survivors and their families have directed much of their frustration and anger at him. They accuse him and his administration of negligence and poor crisis response.
Why?
Well, one of the most heavily criticized aspects of the response is the delay in issuing an emergency alert to mobile phones. This one we were talking about just now. Despite the State Weather Agency issuing a red warning for intense rainfall early in the morning, the emergency alert was not sent out until after 8 p.m. That's a delay of nearly 13 hours. And precisely this gap left residents uninformed and vulnerable as the flooding escalated. For example, one of the things that happened a lot was that people would try to move their cars out of basement car parks for fear they would flood. But then in doing so, many ended up drowning after being caught by the torrent underground. So if the alert had been sent in time, and we will never know this for sure, but it's likely that many lives could have been saved.
And there was also something about Mathon going out for lunch.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what happened. Mathon was having lunch with a journalist, a lunch that lasted 3 hours until 6 p.m. By that time, some towns and villages were already submerged. The initial reports of missing persons were coming in, and it was later confirmed that at that time, many victims had already lost their lives.
Yes, it seems incredible that he wasn't aware of the tragedy that was unfolding.
I think it fueled public outrage very much.
So on the basis of his behaviour, can he be found guilty of a crime or even go to jail?
It's early to say, but so far the Valencian judiciary is currently handling 4 lawsuits and complaints against Mathon, and there are other cases still being processed, so it's likely that more complaints against him will be filed. The accusations include negligent homicide, and it could potentially be aggravated by omission of aid. But the process, as we said, it's going to be long and complex, and at this stage it's very hard to say whether he can be found guilty of any crime or even face jail time.
So obviously the Dana is a national tragedy, but I can think of one possible positive side effect. I imagine that with so much rain, it might have improved the drought situation in Catalonia?
Yes, it did, but not as much as would have been desired. We've been in a drought for 3 years now, reaching the lowest level of water reserves this last March. We did a podcast on that. We had several restrictions across Catalonia. At that time, when the reserves were at their lowest, they were at 14%. Mm-hmm. Then in April, they went back up to 37%. Restrictions were lifted, but then they went back down again to 27%, which is at the level that they were before the Dana. So after the Dana, they are now at 34%. So that's 7 percentage points more than before the Dana.
So every cloud has a silver lining, so to speak.
Exactly.
And I know that Catalans have also shown their solidarity, going to Valencia to help in the aftermath of the disaster and making economic donations. The sense of community and mutual support is heartwarming. Today we've been discussing the Dana that hit the east coast of Spain on the 29th of October in what was one of the worst natural disasters in Spanish history. Thank you to David, Pino, Davide, Faranda and Imma Solé for talking to us. Thank you to Oriol Escudé for joining us and sharing your expertise. That's almost all we have time for today, but before we go, Oriol, what is our Catalan phrase of the week?
Qui sembra vents recull tempestats.
He who sows winds reaps storms.
Exactly.
Very appropriate, Oriol. I guess in English we would say what goes around comes around, or even better, you reap what you sow.
Yep.
It can perhaps be a warning that if we continue to mistreat the planet and climate change advances, we could expect more storms like this in the future. That's all we have time for today. Thank you for listening. Make sure to subscribe to Filling the Sink wherever you get your podcasts if you haven't done so already. We'll be back again next Saturday with another exciting episode of Filling the Sink. On behalf of all the team here at Catalan News, I'm Beth Cohen, wishing you a great weekend. Fins aviat. Adeu.